Daniel Reed had been walking through the dark alien forest for almost 3 hours when he heard a small cry coming from among the trees. The planet was called Velara, a beautiful world, full of blue plants, silver rivers, and strange animals that only moved at night. Daniel was part of a human exploration team, but a sudden storm had separated him from the others. His communication device was damaged, and he was trying to find the nearest settlement when the crying was heard again. This time it sounded closer. It wasn't the sound of an animal, it sounded like a frightened child. Daniel carefully advanced through the thick vegetation until he reached a small clearing. There, next to a broken stone wall, he saw a young alien woman hiding behind a fallen tree. She didn't look older than 10. Her skin was pale blue, her long white hair was covered in dirt, and a thin cut ran across her cheek. Her golden eyes reflected fear. She wore a tattered red dress that seemed far too thin for someone who lived in the forest. When she saw Daniel, she stepped back and picked up a small stone. Her hand was trembling badly. Daniel slowly lowered his weapon. He didn't know her language well, but he did know a few simple words. "Safe," he said, pointing to himself. "I won't hurt you." The girl stared at him for several seconds. Then Daniel noticed something that made his blood run cold. There were fresh footprints in the mud around them. Heavy boots had passed by just moments before. Someone was looking for her. Before Daniel could ask another question, the girl suddenly looked behind her. Her eyes opened wide, and she whispered a word. "Run!" A sharp sound tore through the air. Daniel turned just as an arrow struck the tree next to his head. The metal tip was covered in a dark green liquid. 3 tall alien hunters appeared from among the trees. They wore black armor and masks that concealed their faces. None of them shouted a warning. One simply raised a bow and aimed directly at the girl. Daniel understood instantly. They weren't there to capture her. They wanted her dead. He grabbed her arm and dragged her behind the stone wall as another arrow flew overhead. Daniel fired his weapon at the hunters, forcing them to take cover behind the trees. He knew he couldn't stay there for long. There were too many of them, and the girl could barely walk because she had injured her leg. Daniel picked her up and ran through the woods. Branches hit his face as he ran. Behind him, the hunters followed without stopping. The girl clung tightly to his jacket. Daniel could feel her body trembling, but she wasn't crying, she was just staring back. The men who were pursuing them reached a narrow path beside a deep river. Daniel stopped. The bridge in front of them was destroyed, blocking their way. The hunters were approaching. Daniel positioned the girl behind a large rock and looked for another way out. It was then that the first arrow struck him in the shoulder. An intense pain shot through his body. He looked at the arrow and saw the same green liquid on its tip. Poison. Daniel pulled it out, but his arm was already numb. The girl ran toward him, but Daniel pushed her behind the rock. "Stay down," he ordered. Another arrow flew toward them. Daniel saw where it was headed, straight for the girl's chest. He didn't think, he just moved. The arrow struck him in the side. He gasped for breath as he fell to his knees. The girl screamed. Daniel tried to get up, but the poison was spreading quickly. His vision began to blur, and his heart pounded harder with each passing second. Still, Daniel raised his weapon again. He fired until the hunters were forced to stop. "Go," he told the girl. "Run while you still can." She shook her head and grabbed his hand. Tears filled her golden eyes. She wouldn't abandon him. Daniel looked at her and offered a weak smile. He didn't know who she was or why they wanted her dead. None of that mattered. She was a child, and someone had to protect her. "Live," he whispered. "That's enough." Before the hunters could attack again, a deep sound echoed in the sky. Bright lights cut through the trees as several silver ships appeared above the forest. Armored soldiers descended to the ground and surrounded the hunters. The attackers tried to escape, but were quickly captured. A high-ranking alien officer rushed to the girl and immediately knelt before her. "Princess Lyra," he exclaimed. Daniel heard the word, but he was too weak to understand its meaning. The frightened girl beside him was no ordinary child. She was the missing daughter of the royal family of Lyra. Alien doctors took Daniel to one of the ships. Lyra refused to leave his side. Inside the infirmary, the doctors worked quickly, but the poison was unlike anything they had ever seen in a human body. Daniel's heart was beating slower and slower. A doctor finally said there was only one option. They could place him in a special cryogenic chamber until a cure could be found. It could take years, it might never happen. Daniel had barely woken up when the glass chamber began to close on him. Lyra stood beside the chamber, tears streaming down her face. She placed her small hand against the glass. Daniel slowly raised his and placed it on top of hers from the other side. "I'll remember you," Lyra whispered, "no matter how much time passes." Daniel tried to smile one last time before closing his eyes. The camera went silent, and the machines began their long work. Daniel believed he would wake up soon, or that he would never wake up at all. He never imagined that when he opened his eyes again, 50 years would have passed, and the frightened little girl beside him would be waiting for him like the queen of the world. Daniel didn't know that the world outside his freezer changed every day. For him, there was no sound, no light, no sensation of the passage of time. But Princess Lyra returned to the medical center again and again, always standing beside the human who had saved her life. At first, she was still a frightened child who could barely understand why Daniel would risk his life for a stranger. Every year, she would place her hand on the glass and whisper that she hadn't forgotten her promise. As Lyra grew up, her world became more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Her father, the king, died during a war near the outer colonies, and her mother fell ill a few years later. Suddenly, Lyra was forced to become the leader of Lyra at a very young age. Many powerful nobles believed she was too weak to rule, but Lyra refused to yield the throne to them. Whenever fear gripped her heart, she remembered Daniel standing between her and the poisoned arrows. If a human could face death for a defenseless child, she believed she could face the enemies that surrounded her. Years turned into decades, and Lyra gradually became one of the most powerful rulers Lyra had ever known. She ended ancient wars, protected the impoverished colonies, and created new laws that brought humans and aliens closer together. Throughout the kingdom, people began to hear the story of the human who nearly died protecting his queen when she was a child. Some called Daniel the human shield, while others called him the sleeping guardian. A large statue was even erected in his honor near the royal palace. Although Daniel knew nothing of this honor, one thing never changed. Lyra continued to visit him even after the doctors began to lose hope. The poison had damaged parts of Daniel's body, and any attempt to wake him could kill him within minutes. Many doctors advised Lyra to accept the possibility that he might never open his eyes again. She always gave them the same answer: "He waited for death to save me, so I can wait for science to save him." 50 years after the attack, everything changed one quiet night inside the Royal Medical Center. A young doctor was checking on Daniel's room when a warning light suddenly appeared on the control screen. At first, he thought one of the machines had malfunctioned, but then Daniel's fingers moved inside the glass. His heart rate began to increase, and his frozen body slowly began to respond to treatment. The doctor stared at the screen in shock before sending an emergency message directly to the palace. Queen Lyra was sitting alone when her personal communicator began to flicker. She opened the message and froze after reading just one sentence. The doctor had written, "Your Majesty, Daniel Reed is waking up." Lyra jumped up so fast her chair fell behind her. After 50 long years, the man who remembered her only as a frightened little girl was about to open his eyes, and he had no idea that the boy he had saved now ruled an entire world. Daniel slowly opened his eyes and saw a white light above him. His body felt heavy, and even moving his fingers took a great effort. For a few seconds, he thought he was still inside the rescue ship after the attack. Then he noticed strange machines surrounding his bed that seemed far more advanced than anything he remembered. A young alien doctor quickly called the others when he saw Daniel looking around. Daniel tried to sit up, but a doctor gently stopped him. His throat was dry and his voice came out weak when he asked about the little alien girl. The doctors looked at each other, but none answered him right away. Daniel grew worried and asked again if Lyra had survived the attack in the forest. Finally, a doctor smiled and told him that Lyra was alive and safe. Daniel closed his eyes for a moment and felt relieved because that was all he wanted to hear. Then he looked toward the large window by his bed and was suddenly confused. The small town he remembered was gone, and now a huge, gleaming capital city loomed outside. Tall silver towers reached up to the clouds, while hundreds of flying vehicles crisscrossed the sky. Daniel asked how long he had been asleep, because the world outside looked completely different. The doctor was silent before finally telling him that 50 years had passed. Daniel stared at him, convinced he had misheard the number. Before Daniel could speak again, the doors suddenly flew open and several royal guards entered. They wore gleaming silver armor and immediately lined up in 2 straight rows beside his bed. Daniel tensed up because he didn't understand why royal soldiers were visiting an ordinary human explorer. Then a tall alien woman entered the room, dressed in white and gold robes with a small crown atop her silver hair. She looked powerful, serene, and respected, but tears welled in her golden eyes when she saw Daniel awake. Daniel watched her intently because something in those eyes seemed strangely familiar. The woman walked slowly toward the bed as everyone in the room lowered their heads. Daniel assumed she must be the ruler of Velara, but he still didn't understand why she was there. Then the queen stopped beside him and did something that astonished all the doctors and guards present in the room. She knelt before Daniel's bed and bowed her head. Daniel stared at her, completely confused, and asked why a queen was kneeling before him. The woman looked up and said softly, "Because 50 years ago you stood between death and me." Daniel froze, remembering the frightened little girl. He stared into the queen's golden eyes and finally saw the boy he had protected in the forest. "Lyra," he whispered, unable to believe his eyes. The queen smiled through her tears and gently took his hand. "You told me to live," she said, "so I did." Daniel had saved a helpless alien child, but he was about to discover that his sacrifice had changed far more than just one life. Daniel remained silent as he gazed at Lyra sitting by his bedside. In his memory, she was still the small, frightened girl hiding behind a wall of noise in the forest. Now she was a powerful queen, separated by 50 years of history. Lyra could see the confusion in his eyes, so she quietly told the guards and doctors to leave the room. For the first time since Daniel awoke, the two were finally alone. Lyra began to tell him what had happened after he entered the cryogenic chamber. She explained how her father had died, how her mother had subsequently passed away, and how the throne had passed to her. Daniel listened intently, but felt a pang of sadness knowing that the girl had suffered so much without him. Lyra told him that remembering his bravery had helped her survive the most difficult days of her life. Whenever she felt afraid, she remembered the human who had stood before the poisoned arrows without asking for anything in return. Later that day, Lyra took Daniel around the royal palace in a special medical chair. The palace was larger than any building Daniel had ever seen, with high walls, gleaming floors, and beautiful gardens. Upon reaching the main courtyard, Daniel stopped abruptly because a huge statue stood in the center. The statue depicted a human protecting a small alien child as arrows flew toward him. Daniel stared in disbelief as he realized the person in the statue was himself. Lyra explained that his story had become famous throughout Velara many years ago. Children learned about his sacrifice in school. Soldiers used his story as an example of bravery, and people called him the human shield. Daniel felt uneasy because he had never wanted to become a hero or a legend. He told Lyra that he had only helped a frightened girl because abandoning her would have been wrong. Lyra smiled and said that this simple answer was precisely why his people respected him so much. As they continued their tour of the palace, Daniel noticed that not everyone seemed pleased to see him. Several elderly nobles watched him from a balcony with cold stares and impassive faces. One of them was Lord Bark, an influential member of the royal council who had served the palace for many years. Bark turned slowly when Daniel looked at him, but Daniel had already noticed the anger in his eyes. Something about that man made Daniel feel the same danger he had felt in the forest 50 years before. That night, Lyra returned Daniel to his guarded room and promised he would be safe inside the palace. Daniel thanked her, but after she left, he noticed a small shadow moving behind the door. A moment later, a thin metal object slid silently across the floor and stopped beside his bed. Daniel carefully picked it up and felt his blood run cold when he saw what it was. It was an ancient arrowhead covered with a dark green marking that looked exactly like the poison from 50 years ago. Someone inside the royal palace wanted Daniel to understand that the past hadn't ended with him. Daniel kept the old arrowhead hidden under his pillow until Queen Lyra returned the next morning. He showed it to her without saying a word, and the calm expression on her face vanished instantly. Lyra summoned her most trusted guard and ordered him to lock all the entrances to Daniel's room. She recognized the dark green mark because that same poison had nearly killed Daniel 50 years earlier. Inside the palace, someone was not only watching him, but also wanted him to be afraid. Lyra wanted Daniel moved to a hidden room beneath the palace, but he refused to go into hiding. He told her that whoever sent the arrowhead might make another mistake if they thought he was still an easy target. Daniel's body was weak after 50 years of sleep, but his mind remained sharp and perceptive. He began observing the servants, guards, and nobles who entered the medical wing during the day. A strange detail soon caught his attention. The same young guard passed by his door 3 times for no apparent reason. That night, Daniel pretended to be asleep, while 2 royal guards stood outside his room. Around midnight, the lights suddenly went out, and the medical machines surrounding his bed stopped for several seconds. Daniel heard a soft sound by the window and saw a shadow enter the room. A masked attacker approached his bed with a thin blade coated in the same dark green poison. Daniel rolled over just before the knife blade descended, and with all his remaining strength, pulled the attacker to the floor. The attacker quickly recovered and raised the blade again, but the door burst open before he could strike. Lyra entered, accompanied by several royal soldiers, and the masked figure tried to escape through the window. A guard stopped him and removed his mask, revealing him to be the same young palace soldier Daniel had recognized earlier. Lyra demanded to know who had ordered the attack, but the soldier remained silent and stared down the corridor. Before anyone could question him again, he suddenly collapsed, having been implanted with a hidden poison capsule within his armor. Daniel searched the attacker's clothing while the medics tried to save his life. In a small pocket, he found a black metal symbol shaped like a broken crown. Lyra paled because she had only seen that symbol once before in some secret documents from her childhood. The same mark belonged to the group blamed for the attack in the forest 50 years earlier. Daniel finally understood that the poisoned arrows, his long sleep, and that night's attack were all connected. Lyra ordered the palace sealed and called an emergency meeting of her royal council. Daniel watched as Lord Bayek entered the room with the other nobles, his expression as serene as before. When Bayek saw the broken crown symbol on the table, his eyes changed for a moment. Daniel noticed this slight reaction, though no one else seemed to see it. He leaned toward Lyra and said softly, "The people who tried to kill you 50 years ago never disappeared." Then he looked directly at Bayek and added, "I believe one of them has been standing by your throne this whole time." Daniel and Lyra spent the next morning locked in a room beneath the royal palace. On a large table in front of them lay ancient documents dating back 50 years. Most of the files had been archived by the old royal council. Following the attack in the forest, Daniel noticed that several names had been removed from the reports for no clear reason. One name appeared repeatedly before suddenly disappearing from all subsequent records. That name belonged to Lord Bark's father, Commander Seron. Lyra dug deeper and found a hidden report written by one of her father's trusted bodyguards. The report indicated that Commander Seron had secretly paid soldiers to remove the young princess from the royal family. Had Lyra died, another branch of the family might have seized the throne. Bayek's family would then have gained power over the new ruler and the entire kingdom. The arrows, the poisoned women, had never been part of a random attack by mere hunters. They had been sent to kill Lyra before she was old enough to rule. Daniel suddenly understood why someone had tried to kill him after waking up. He was the only person alive who had seen the attackers up close during the attack in the forest. His return could reopen questions that Bayek had tried to bury for 50 years. Lyra was furious, but Daniel warned her not to arrest Bayek without solid evidence. They needed something strong enough to expose him to the entire kingdom. Otherwise, Bayek could claim that the queen was targeting an innocent member of her own council. Before they could finalize their plan, alarms suddenly shook the palace walls. A royal guard burst into the room and said that armed soldiers had taken control of the East Gate. Several council members had joined Bayek, and hundreds of rebel troops were advancing on the palace. Bayek had realized that his secret was about to be revealed, so he decided to attack. First, Lyra ordered Daniel to enter a secure underground chamber while she prepared to defend the throne. Daniel looked at her and gave the same calm reply he had given 50 years earlier. He told Lyra that he hadn't placed himself between her and the poison. It arrows just to hide. Now Daniel studied the map of the palace and immediately realized that Bayek's forces were entering through narrow interior alleyways. He suggested closing 2 gates and making the rebels believe the central courtyard was open. When the rebels stormed inside, the loyal soldiers could surround them on 3 sides. Lyra trusted Daniel's simple plan because human ingenuity had saved her once before. Within minutes, the palace defenders began taking up positions. Bayek's troops entered the courtyard just as Daniel had expected and suddenly found all the exits locked. Royal soldiers emerged from the walls while loyal ships sailed over the palace from above. Bayek realized too late that his entire attack had backfired. It had become a trap, but instead of surrendering, he grabbed a gun and ran toward the private royal chamber. Daniel saw him disappear through the door and knew exactly where he was going. Bayek was making one last attempt to kill Queen Lyra before the truth could destroy him. Daniel followed Bayek to the royal chamber as alarms continued to blare throughout the palace. His body was weak, but he refused to let Lyra face danger alone. Inside the chamber, Bayek stood on the throne with a gun pointed directly at the queen. He blamed Lyra for destroying everything his family had tried to build for 50 years. Lyra remained calm, but Daniel could see that Bayek was ready to fire. Bayek told Daniel that he should have died in the forest 50 years ago. He said that a human being had foiled a plan that could have placed his family above the royal house. Daniel approached slowly and kept Bayek talking while Lyra waited for the right moment. Bayek became enraged and instead pointed his gun at Daniel. Daniel smiled weakly and said, "You made the same mistake your men made before. You're staring at me while the girl you fear is still standing." Lyra reacted immediately and snatched the weapon from Bayek's hand. The royal guards stormed into the hall and surrounded him before he could escape. Bayek shouted that his followers would continue fighting, but the battle outside was already winding down. His soldiers, trapped in the area, surrendered after discovering that the royal army controlled all the exits. The hidden documents were handed over to the council and proved what Bayek's family had done. The secret of the poisoned arrows was finally revealed after 50 long years. Several days later, thousands of people gathered in the grand square in front of the palace. Daniel stood beside Lyra as citizens thronged the streets around them. He expected the queen to present him with a medal and allow him to return to a peaceful life. Instead, Lyra descended the royal staircase and stopped right in front of him. To Daniel's astonishment, she slowly knelt before the entire kingdom. The crowd fell silent as his queen bowed before a human. Daniel quickly asked her to stand because he had never wanted anyone to kneel before him. Lyra looked up, tears welling in her golden eyes, and reminded him of the frightened child in the forest. She said that Daniel knew nothing of his crown, his family, or the future that awaited him. He had simply seen a helpless child and decided that her life mattered more than his own safety. "For 50 years, this kingdom has called you a hero," Lyra said, "but to me, you will always be the man who told a frightened child to live." Daniel helped Lyra to her feet as the people in the plaza began to cheer. He had lost 50 years, but he finally understood that those years had not been in vain. A single act of bravery had saved a child, protected a kingdom, and changed the way 2 species viewed each other. Daniel chose to remain in Velara as a friend and protector of the royal family. His story became proof that humanity's greatest strength didn't lie in its weapons or technology. Sometimes, the strongest person was simply the one willing to stand between danger and someone who couldn't protect themselves.